The first time I realized my neighbor had made a very expensive mistake, I was standing behind my garage watching a utility crew spray bright orange markings across the ground. At first, I assumed they were marking something in my yard because that's where the old service pole sat. Then one of the painted lines curved sharply, crossed the property line, and ran straight through the center of the most carefully maintained flower bed I'd ever seen. That's when I looked over at my neighbor, Grant, and for the first time in weeks, he didn't look confident. He looked nervous. The funny part is that none of this would have happened if he had simply left my utility pole alone. A few months earlier, Grant had finished what he proudly called a complete backyard transformation. Every weekend there seemed to be another delivery truck pulling into his driveway. One week it was decorative stone, the next week it was custom brick edging, then expensive shrubs, imported flowers, and raised garden beds. By the time he was finished, his backyard looked less like a suburban lawn and more like something you'd see in a landscaping magazine. I'll give him credit where it's due. It looked impressive. The problem was that Grant didn't just want his property to look perfect. He wanted everything around his property to look perfect too. Unfortunately for him, there was one thing he couldn't stop staring at. Behind my garage stood an old wooden utility pole. It wasn't glamorous. Nobody would ever mistake it for a piece of art. But it had been there for decades. When I bought the property, it was already there. Old photographs from previous owners showed the same pole standing in exactly the same location years before I ever moved in. The power line ran from the road, crossed part of the back lots, and supplied electricity to my house and a couple of older outbuildings on the property. It worked perfectly, and frankly, I rarely even noticed it. Grant noticed it every day. One afternoon, he walked over while I was trimming weeds near the fence. He leaned against the gate and said, "You ever think about moving that thing?" I honestly thought he was joking. "Moving what?" I asked. He pointed directly at the utility pole. "That. It ruins the view from my patio." I laughed because I assumed he didn't understand how utility infrastructure works. "Grant, that's not my pole. It belongs to the power company." He shrugged. "Still seems like you could ask them to move it." I explained that utility poles aren't lawn ornaments. You don't just pick a new location because somebody doesn't like looking at them. The placement had been approved years ago, probably decades ago. Everything was legal. Everything was functioning normally. I figured that would be the end of the conversation. It wasn't. Over the following weeks, he brought it up repeatedly. Sometimes casually, sometimes with obvious irritation. He'd mention how much money he'd invested in his landscaping. He'd complain about the view from his outdoor seating area. Once he even suggested that the pole might be unsafe because it looked old. Every time I gave him essentially the same answer. The pole wasn't mine. The power company maintained it. If they thought it needed replacement, they'd replace it. If they thought it needed relocation, they'd relocate it. Until then, it stayed where it was. Eventually he stopped bringing it up, and honestly, that should have been my warning sign. People like Grant don't suddenly let things go. They usually just start looking for another way to get what they want. Sure enough, about 3 weeks later, I noticed a utility truck parked behind the properties. A technician was examining the pole with a clipboard in one hand and a measuring device in the other. I walked over and introduced myself. That's when I learned Grant had filed a formal complaint with the power company. According to the report, the pole was allegedly leaning, improperly installed, and potentially hazardous. The technician spent nearly 30 minutes inspecting everything. He checked the base, studied the hardware, examined the wires overhead, and reviewed records on a tablet. When he finished, he smiled politely and said, "The pole is fine." I glanced toward Grant's yard and saw him watching from a distance. His expression immediately tightened. But then the technician added something unexpected. He explained that while the pole itself wasn't a problem, the complaint had triggered a broader inspection process. Apparently part of the service line feeding the pole traveled underground before emerging near the base. The installation records dated back decades, and some sections of the original route weren't perfectly documented. Because a safety complaint had been filed, they now needed to verify the underground cable path before closing the case. At the time, that sounded like routine bureaucracy. I didn't think much of it. Grant didn't seem concerned either. In fact, he looked relieved when the technician drove away. What neither of us realized was that his complaint had just activated a chain of events that was about to lead an excavation crew directly into the middle of his prized garden. Now, before I get back to the story, Let me explain something, because this is where a lot of people misunderstand how these situations work. According to standard procedure, when someone files a safety complaint involving utility infrastructure, the company can't simply glance at the equipment and walk away. Once the report enters the system, documentation requirements kick in, inspections get recorded, and sometimes additional verification becomes mandatory even if the original complaint turns out to be completely wrong. From a legal perspective, utility companies are actually protecting themselves when they do this. If they ignore a complaint and something later fails, they're exposed to liability. So they investigate everything connected to the issue, not just the part someone complained about. What's fascinating is that this is also a psychological trap people fall into all the time. This is a psychological trap because people assume they can control the outcome once they start a complaint process. They imagine the investigation will only hurt the other person and somehow leave their own interests untouched. Real life rarely works that way. Once professionals get involved, they follow procedures, not personal agendas. And in Grant's case, that distinction was about to become extremely expensive. 2 days after the inspection, the locating crew arrived just after sunrise. I remember hearing the soft beeping of their equipment before I even looked outside. By the time I walked behind my garage with a cup of coffee, 3 workers were already moving across the property, marking the ground with fluorescent paint. Most of the markings stayed where I expected them to stay, running through sections of my backyard that had been associated with the utility line for decades. Then one worker stopped, checked his locator again, and continued tracing the signal. The painted line drifted toward the property boundary. Another few feet, and it crossed into Grant's yard. Another few feet, and it went directly through one of his raised flower beds. I watched Grant emerge from his back door almost immediately. The man moved fast when his landscaping was involved. He marched across the lawn and asked the crew leader if there had been some kind of mistake. The crew leader checked his handheld device and calmly said they were simply following the cable signal. Grant pointed at the garden. That can't be right. The worker shrugged. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. That's why we're locating it. What made the whole thing almost comical was that Grant was still operating under the assumption that someone would eventually realize the line wasn't there. He treated the markings like a rough draft that would later be corrected. But every few minutes another painted arrow appeared, and every new mark reinforced the same conclusion. The cable route wasn't hugging the property line. It was cutting diagonally beneath the corner of his yard. By the afternoon, orange and yellow markings stretched through areas he had spent months perfecting. That's when I noticed the confidence starting to disappear. For weeks he had carried himself like a man certain he was going to win some neighborhood battle. Now he looked like someone watching a storm slowly move toward his house. The next morning the excavation crew arrived. Not a huge construction operation, nothing dramatic by utility standards, but dramatic enough if the digging was happening in your favorite flower bed. There was a small excavator, several trucks, safety barriers, tools, and a crew supervisor carrying paperwork. Grant was outside before the engines even stopped running. He immediately began asking questions. How much digging are you planning to do? Can you just use the locator? Do you really need to excavate? The supervisor remained polite. He explained that the work order required visual confirmation of the underground line. Since the original complaint involved safety concerns, the company had authorized a complete verification process. Grant didn't like that answer. But the pole already passed inspection. The supervisor nodded. Correct. Then why are you digging? The supervisor gave an answer that I still remember because of how perfectly it summarized the entire situation. Because the inspection isn't finished. That sentence seemed to hit him harder than anything else. For the first time he understood that the process he started no longer belonged to him. He couldn't stop it. He couldn't redirect it. He couldn't decide which parts were investigated and which parts were ignored. The machine was moving forward because procedures required it to move forward. Work began carefully. To be fair to the crew, they were extremely professional. They didn't tear through the property recklessly. Decorative stones were removed by hand. Plants were protected where possible. Soil was excavated methodically. But excavation is still excavation. There is no magical version of digging that leaves everything exactly as it was before. Within an hour, sections of Grant's garden looked noticeably different. The first trench revealed part of the buried utility line. The workers documented its depth and condition. Then they moved farther along the route and opened another section. That trench cut directly across one of the raised beds. I watched Grant stare at it with the expression of a man experiencing physical pain. Every shovel of soil seemed to hurt him. Every stone moved from its original position looked like a personal insult. At one point he approached me while the crew worked. "This is ridiculous," he said. I looked toward the trench. "Looks expensive." He frowned. "They didn't have to do all this." I took a sip of coffee and replied, "Apparently they did." He didn't appreciate that answer. The excavation continued through the afternoon. Additional sections of the cable were exposed and inspected. The line itself turned out to be in excellent condition. No damage, no deterioration, no safety concerns, no installation violations. Everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. Ironically, the deeper the company investigated, the more thoroughly they confirmed that the infrastructure Grant had complained about was functioning perfectly. The only thing suffering damage during the process was his landscaping. Late in the day, the supervisor completed the final documentation. Measurements were recorded. Photographs were taken. Notes were entered into the system. The conclusion was straightforward. The utility pole was stable. The underground service line was properly installed. The route was verified. No corrective action was required. Case closed. If this story ended there, it would already be satisfying enough. But there was one final moment that made the entire experience unforgettable. As the crew prepared to leave, Grant asked whether the garden would be restored exactly as it had been before. The supervisor answered honestly. The trenches would be filled. The soil would be replaced. The stones would be returned. Reasonable restoration would be completed. But no contractor on Earth can perfectly recreate months of careful landscaping after excavation work. Nature doesn't work that way. Construction doesn't work that way. Reality doesn't work that way. Grant stood silently as the crew finished restoring the disturbed areas. Technically, everything was repaired. Practically, everything looked different. The perfect symmetry was gone. The decorative stone patterns weren't identical. The flower beds no longer had that untouched magazine cover appearance he had worked so hard to create. Most people probably wouldn't have noticed. Grant definitely noticed. Over the following weeks, I watched him spend countless hours trying to restore the original layout. He repositioned stones, replanted flowers, adjusted borders, raked soil. Yet somehow the garden never looked quite the same. Maybe the difference was physical. Maybe part of it was psychological. Once you know something has been disturbed, you tend to see imperfections that nobody else sees. The most remarkable part, though, was what happened afterward. Or more accurately, what didn't happen. Grant never mentioned the utility pole again. Not once. No more complaints. No more suggestions about relocating it. No more comments about the view from his patio. The old wooden pole remained exactly where it had always been. The wires remained exactly where they had always been. The only thing that changed was the condition of the garden belonging to the man who tried to start the investigation in the first place. Looking back, I think the entire situation became a perfect example of unintended consequences. Grant assumed he was initiating a process that would pressure somebody else into solving his problem. Instead, he triggered a process that forced professionals to verify every detail connected to his complaint. And once those professionals started following procedures, they uncovered something he never bothered to consider. The utility infrastructure he hated didn't care about property aesthetics, landscaping plans, or personal preferences. It only cared about where it had been installed decades ago. In the end, the pole never moved an inch. The investigation found nothing wrong. The power company closed its file. The infrastructure stayed exactly where it was. Yet somehow the biggest change happened in the one place Grant was trying hardest to protect. His own backyard. A few months after everything happened, I was sitting in my backyard one evening watching the sun drop behind the trees, and my eyes landed on that same old utility pole. It looked exactly the way it had looked before the complaint, before the inspection, before the excavation crew, before all the frustration and drama. The pole hadn't changed. The wires hadn't changed. The power flowing through them hadn't changed. The only thing that had changed was how I viewed the entire situation. At first, I thought this story was about a utility pole. Then I thought it was about a neighbor dispute. Eventually, I realized it was really about control. A lot of neighborhood conflicts start when someone becomes convinced they should have authority over things they don't actually own, manage, or understand. Grant wasn't really angry about the pole itself. The pole had existed for decades. It wasn't dangerous. It wasn't malfunctioning. It wasn't creating any real hardship. What bothered him was that it existed outside his control. He had transformed his backyard into exactly what he wanted, and the presence of that old utility structure reminded him there were limits to how much influence he actually had over the world around him. This is a psychological trap that shows up everywhere, not just between neighbors. People convince themselves that if they push hard enough, complain loudly enough, or involve enough authorities, reality will eventually bend to match their preferences. Sometimes that works. A lot of times it doesn't. And occasionally it produces the exact opposite result. From a legal perspective, the situation is actually pretty simple. Utility companies aren't in the landscaping business. Their responsibility is reliability, safety, documentation, and compliance. According to standard procedure, once a formal safety complaint enters the system, professionals are expected to investigate facts, not feelings. They don't ask which neighbor is more persuasive. They don't ask whose backyard looks nicer. They follow records, measurements, inspections, and established processes. That's exactly what happened here. The moment the complaint became official, the outcome stopped being controlled by the person who filed it. The lesson here is that processes have consequences. Once you activate them, you don't always get to choose where they lead. Sometimes they validate your concerns. Sometimes they reveal problems you never expected. And sometimes they come right back around and create inconvenience for the very person who started them. What still makes me laugh is how avoidable the entire thing was. If Grant had simply ignored the pole, his garden would have remained untouched. The utility company wouldn't have visited. No excavation crew would have arrived. No trenches would have crossed his flower beds. Everything would have stayed exactly the way he wanted it. Instead, his determination to remove a problem ended up creating a much bigger one. And honestly, that's why this story stuck with me long after it was over. Not because anyone won some great battle. Not because there was a dramatic legal showdown. But because it demonstrated something we all occasionally forget. Just because you can file a complaint doesn't mean you're going to like the investigation. Sometimes the facts cooperate with your expectations. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes they uncover things you'd rather leave buried. So now I'm curious what you think. If you were in my position, would you have handled the situation differently? If you were the utility company, would you have followed the same inspection process? And if you were Grant, would you have filed the complaint in the first place knowing what happened afterward? Let me know down in the comments because stories like this always split people into two camps. The ones who think he got exactly what he deserved, and the ones who think he was simply unlucky enough to discover how bureaucracy really works.